Evelyn Robinson, an elderly black woman, is wrongfully stopped and mistreated by Officer John Foster due to his ingrained biases. After the incident, Evelyn becomes the face of a movement advocating for police reform, while John grapples with guilt and realizes his prejudices. Through community protests and difficult conversations, John seeks redemption by working in community outreach, striving to rebuild trust. Evelyn, while cautious, continues to push for change, and both characters grow through their personal journeys. The story highlights the importance of accountability, forgiveness, and the potential for growth and healing within communities. Welcome to today's story. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next exciting stories. Let's enjoy. John Foster woke up to the shrill sound of his alarm clock at 6:30 a.m., just as he had done every morning for the past 7 years. The smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen filled his small suburban house, a comforting scent that had become part of his daily ritual. His wife, Claire, always got up before him, preparing breakfast and packing his lunch for the day. It was their unspoken routine, a partnership forged over years of shared responsibilities. John sat up in bed, rubbing his hands over his face, trying to shake off the remnants of sleep. Today wasn't supposed to be anything special. Another day on patrol, another set of shifts to get through before he could come home and relax. He glanced over at Claire, who was already busy at the kitchen counter, her blonde hair tied back into a neat ponytail. She was humming softly to herself, completely absorbed in the task of making eggs. "Mornin', love," he muttered, sliding out of bed and heading for the shower. The water was lukewarm as usual, the pipes in their modest home never quite capable of delivering hot water when they needed it most. But John didn't mind. He was used to it. Claire greeted him with a warm smile when he reemerged, fully dressed in his uniform, dark blue with the badge that had become a part of his identity. "You want some eggs and toast?" "Sure, thanks." He sat down at the small kitchen table, listening to the quiet hum of the neighborhood waking up outside. The occasional sound of a car engine, kids playing in the distance, a dog barking. Everything seemed peaceful. But John knew better than to take that peace for granted. His job had shown him the dark underbelly of life, even in the quietest suburbs. "Big day ahead?" Claire asked, sitting down across from him with her own plate of toast. "Nothing special," John replied between bites. "Patrolling the same areas as usual. Should be pretty quiet." Claire nodded, her eyes flickering with concern. She never liked to ask too much about his job, knowing the stories he carried home with him were often ones he didn't want to share. But she always listened when he did, always ready to support him, however she could. As John finished his breakfast and grabbed his keys, he kissed Claire on the cheek. "I'll be home by 6. Call me if you need anything." "Be safe," she said softly, watching as he headed out the door. John's patrol area was an older part of town, filled with tree-lined streets and houses that had seen better days. Some were well kept, with neatly trimmed lawns and fresh coats of paint. Others had fallen into disrepair, with overgrown yards and peeling siding, their owners long gone or too elderly to maintain them. The neighborhood had changed over the years, becoming a mixture of old-timers and newer, younger families who had moved in as the city expanded. There was a sense of quietness here, but also a tension that John had learned to recognize after years on the job. Some of the older residents didn't get along with the newer ones. There were unspoken divisions, simmering beneath the surface of the community. John parked his patrol car at the corner of Elm and Washington, the spot he usually started his morning rounds. He stepped out of the car and surveyed the street. It was a sunny day, the kind of day that made it seem like nothing could go wrong. Kids played in the yards, dogs barked at passers-by, and the elderly sat on their porches, watching the world go by. He saw Mrs. Henderson, a widow who lived alone, watering her garden. She waved at him, and he waved back. She was one of the old-timers, someone John had known for years. Her house was immaculate, with a neatly trimmed rose garden that she tended to every morning without fail. John continued his patrol, walking the familiar streets, nodding at the occasional passerby. But as he turned the corner onto Maple Avenue, his attention was drawn to a woman walking slowly down the sidewalk. She was older, dressed in a long coat even though the day was warming up. Her pace was deliberate, her eyes scanning the houses as she moved. John recognized her. It was Evelyn Robinson. He'd seen her before on these streets, usually on her way to the grocery store or the park. She was always quiet, never causing any trouble. But something about the way she moved today caught his attention. Maybe it was the way she was walking slower than usual. Maybe it was the way her eyes seemed to linger a little too long on the houses she passed. Whatever it was, John felt his instincts kick in, an unease settling in his chest. He couldn't explain it, but something about her seemed off today. John watched Evelyn for a moment longer, debating with himself whether to approach her or let her continue on her way. She wasn't doing anything wrong. She was just walking. But the sense of unease wouldn't leave him. His training had taught him to trust his instincts, to always be on the lookout for anything that seemed unusual, even if it didn't make sense at first glance. He crossed the street, walking toward her, his hand resting lightly on the radio at his belt. "Mrs. Robinson?" he called out as he got closer. Evelyn stopped and turned to face him, her eyes calm but questioning. "Yes, officer." John hesitated for a moment. Up close, she didn't look suspicious. She looked like the same elderly woman he had seen countless times before, but the feeling of unease remained. "Is everything all right?" he asked. His tone was more formal than usual. Evelyn frowned slightly as if confused by the question. "I'm just on my way to the store, Officer Foster." "Is there something wrong?" John opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say? That something about her just seemed her off? That he couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong here today, even though he knew that wasn't true? Instead, he cleared his throat and nodded. No, just wanted to check. Have a good day, Mrs. Robinson." Evelyn smiled faintly, her expression still laced with confusion. "Thank you, officer. I'll be on my way then." As she turned to continue down the street, John's grip on his radio tightened. He watched her walk for a few more steps, the uneasy feeling in his chest refusing to leave. And then, almost without thinking, he called out to her again. "Mrs. Robinson, wait a moment." Evelyn stopped once more, turning to face him. This time her expression was more guarded, her eyes narrowing slightly. John's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what was driving him, what was making him push this encounter further. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His instincts, the ones that had kept him safe on the job for years, were screaming at him to dig deeper. "Can I see some identification?" he asked, his voice firmer now. Evelyn blinked, her expression shifting from confusion to something closer to disbelief. "Identification. Officer, I've lived in this neighborhood for over 40 years. You know who I am." John felt a flush of embarrassment rise in his cheeks, but he couldn't back down now. "It's just protocol, Mrs. Robinson. I need to make sure everything's in order." Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes never leaving his. There was no fear in her gaze, only a quiet dignity that made John feel even more uncomfortable. Deliberately, she reached into her purse and pulled out her wallet. Her movements were steady, controlled, but John could sense the tension in the air. She handed him her ID without a word, her eyes hard as she watched him. John took the ID, glancing at it briefly. He knew it was unnecessary, knew there was no reason to push this any further. But the unease in his chest had turned into something else, something darker, more insistent. He handed the ID back to her, his hands shaking slightly. "Thank you, Mrs. Robinson. You're free to go." Evelyn took the ID and slid it back into her purse, her movements just as controlled as before. But this time, there was no faint smile, no polite farewell. She turned and walked away without another word, her back straight, her head held high. John watched her go, his heart still pounding. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just crossed a line, that something in that brief encounter had gone horribly wrong, but he didn't know how to fix it. As Evelyn continued down the street, her mind was racing. She had always believed in the importance of respecting authority, of following the rules. But today had been different. Today she had been treated like a suspect, like someone who didn't belong in her own neighborhood. And that was something she couldn't ignore. She had seen enough in her life to recognize when she was being profiled, when her skin color was being used against her. It wasn't the first time, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But today it stung more than usual. Maybe it was because she had known John Foster for years, had seen him patrolling these streets, had waved at him in passing. She had never expected him to treat her like this. Evelyn's steps slowed as she reached the corner of Maple and Main, her hand tightening around the strap of her purse. She could feel the eyes of the community on her, the weight of their expectations pressing down on her shoulders. She wasn't sure what to do. Should she report the incident? Should she let it go, chalk it up to a misunderstanding, and move on with her day? But deep down, Evelyn knew that this was about more than just her. This was about all the other people in the community who had been treated the same way. People who had been stopped, questioned, and made to feel like they didn't belong simply because of the color of their skin. She couldn't stay silent. By the time Evelyn reached her home, the weight of the encounter with John had settled heavily on her shoulders. She sat down on her porch, staring out at the street, her mind racing with thoughts of what had just happened. But she wasn't alone for long. Word of the incident spread quickly through the neighborhood. Neighbors who had seen the interaction between Evelyn and John began talking, sharing their own stories of feeling watched, of being treated with suspicion. It wasn't long before Aaron Thompson, a young community activist, arrived at Evelyn's door. "Mrs. Robinson," Aaron said, his voice filled with concern, "I heard about what happened with Officer Foster. Are you all right?" Evelyn looked up at him, her eyes tired but determined. "I'm fine, Aaron, but I'm not sure I should let this go." Aaron nodded, his expression serious. "You shouldn't. What happened to you isn't right, and it's not the first time something like this has happened in our community. We need to address this." Evelyn sighed, her hands resting in her lap. "I don't want to cause trouble, Aaron. I just want to live my life in peace." "I understand," Aaron said gently, "but sometimes staying silent doesn't bring peace. Sometimes we have to speak up to make things better for everyone." Evelyn was silent for a long moment, the weight of his words settling in her chest. She knew Aaron was right. She had lived through too much to ignore what had happened, to pretend that everything was fine. "All right," she finally said, her voice steady. "I'll speak up." Evelyn Robinson's decision to speak up about her encounter with Officer John Foster had been difficult, but she knew it was the right choice. Within days, the incident became the center of conversation throughout the community. It started with whispers between neighbors, but soon those whispers grew louder, echoing in the halls of the local grocery stores, on street corners, and even inside homes. The neighborhood had always been close-knit, but it was also a place where change was slow and resistance to that change often met with silence. Now, with the story of Evelyn's experience spreading, there was a sense that things wouldn't go back to the way they were before. The tension that had been quietly simmering under the surface had come to a boil. At first, Evelyn tried to avoid the spotlight. She hadn't set out to become a symbol of anything, and she certainly didn't want to create division. But the community's response was undeniable. Neighbors came by to offer their support, expressing their own frustration with how law enforcement had treated them over the years. Many felt that Evelyn's experience was a reflection of a larger problem. Among those offering support was Aaron Thompson, the community activist who had been passionate about addressing issues of racial profiling and policing for years. He organized a meeting at the local community center, inviting residents to come and share their experiences. Evelyn reluctantly agreed to attend, unsure of how involved she wanted to be. The night of the meeting, the community center was packed. People of all ages and backgrounds gathered in the small hall, their faces a mix of anger, frustration, and hope. Aaron stood in front of the room, his calm but determined demeanor commanding attention. Evelyn sat in the back at first, wanting to observe rather than participate. She wasn't used to this kind of attention, and still wasn't sure what her role in all of it should be. But as the meeting began and people shared their stories, she felt a growing sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the entire community. "I've lived here my whole life," one woman said, standing up from her seat. "But in the last few years, I've felt like I'm being watched every time I walk out of my house. It's not right." A young man in his 20s stood next. "They treat us like criminals before we've even done anything wrong. How are we supposed to trust the people who are supposed to protect us?" The stories continued, one after another, painting a picture of a community that had long felt disconnected from the police force meant to serve them. As Evelyn listened, she realized that her story was just one of many, each one adding to the larger narrative of mistrust and fear. Aaron finally turned to Evelyn, his eyes filled with understanding. "Mrs. Robinson, would you like to share your experience? All eyes in the room turned toward her, and for a moment Evelyn hesitated. She had never been one to seek attention, and speaking in front of a crowd was far from her comfort zone. But she knew that her voice mattered, that it could make a difference. She stood slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she approached the front of the room. The crowd grew silent, waiting for her to speak. "What happened to me wasn't new," Evelyn began, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. "I've seen things like this before, more times than I care to count. But that doesn't mean it gets easier. Being treated like you don't belong, like you're a suspect in your own neighborhood. It hurts. And it's not just me. It's all of us." There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd, people nodding their heads in solidarity. "I've lived here for over 40 years, Evelyn continued. I've seen this community change, seen it grow, and I've always believed that we should treat each other with respect. But lately it feels like that respect isn't being returned by the people who are supposed to keep us safe." The room remained silent, but Evelyn could feel the weight of the words hanging in the air. She hadn't wanted to become the face of anything, but now that she was here, she knew she couldn't turn back. The community needed change, and if her story could help make that happen, then she was willing to speak up. While the community rallied around Evelyn, John Foster was living through his own turmoil. After the encounter with Evelyn, something had shifted inside him. He couldn't stop replaying the incident in his mind. The moment he had asked for her ID, the way her eyes had stared back at him, calm but full of disappointment. John had always prided himself on being a good cop, someone who followed the rules and kept the peace. But now, for the first time in his career, he found himself questioning everything. Had he acted out of line? Had he let his own biases cloud his judgment? These were questions that he had never had to confront before, and the answers made him uneasy. The media had gotten wind of the story, and while it wasn't a national headline, it was big news in the local paper. John's name hadn't been mentioned yet, but it was only a matter of time. His fellow officers were starting to talk, and though no one had come out and said anything directly, John could feel the tension at the station. Captain Myers had called him into his office one afternoon, and John knew it wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. "Foster, sit down," Captain Myers said, his tone stern but not unkind. John obeyed, feeling like a child about to be scolded. "I've heard about the incident with Mrs. Robinson," Myers continued, leaning back in his chair. "It's starting to get some attention, and not the good kind. I need to know what happened out there." John hesitated, unsure of how to explain what had driven him to stop Evelyn in the first place. "I don't know, sir," he finally said, his voice low. "Something just didn't feel right. I thought I was following protocol, but now, I'm not so sure." Myers sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, Foster, I know you're a good cop. You've been with us for years, and you've never had any issues. But this doesn't look good. We're going to need to do some damage control, and that starts with you figuring out what went wrong." John nodded, though he wasn't sure what else to say. He had followed his instincts, the same instincts that had kept him safe on the job for years. But now those instincts feel like they had betrayed him. "I'm putting you on leave for a while," Myers said, his tone final. "Take some time to think about things. We'll see where we go from here." John left the captain's office feeling a heavy weight on his shoulders. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure who he was anymore. The badge that had once been a symbol of pride now felt like a burden. John's wife, Claire, had always been supportive of his work, even when the long hours and the stress of the job took a toll on their marriage. But when John came home that evening and told her what had happened, she didn't know how to respond. They sat at the kitchen table, the same place where they had shared countless meals. But tonight the air between them was thick with tension. "I don't know what to say," Claire admitted, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee mug. "You've always been so careful, so by the book. How did this happen?" John shook his head, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. "I don't know, I really don't. I thought I was doing the right thing, but now I'm not sure anymore." Claire sighed, her expression conflicted. "Do you think you were wrong? Do you think you overreacted?" "I don't know," John said again, his voice thick with frustration. "I've seen Evelyn before. She's lived here forever, but something about that day just felt off. I don't know if it was me or her or something else." Claire reached across the table, placing her hand on top of his. You're not a bad person, John. You've spent your whole life protecting people. But maybe this is a wake-up call. Maybe this is a chance for you to think about things differently." John looked up at her, his heart heavy. "I'm not sure I know how to do that." As the days passed, the story of Evelyn's encounter with John continued to gain traction in the local media. The community was divided. Some people defended John, saying that he was just doing his job, while others sided with Evelyn, arguing that what had happened to her was part of a larger pattern of racial profiling in law enforcement. Journalists reached out to both Evelyn and John for comments. Evelyn, always private, was reluctant to speak to the press, but Aaron encouraged her to share her story in the hopes of raising awareness about the issue. John, on the other hand, was advised by the department's PR team to remain silent for the time being. His superiors wanted to handle the situation internally, hoping that the media attention would die down on its own. But John knew it wouldn't be that easy. The damage had already been done, and no amount of silence would undo what had happened. One afternoon, John was sitting at home, watching the news, when a report about the incident came on. The reporter stood in front of a group of protesters gathered outside the police station, holding signs that read, "Justice for Evelyn" and "End Racial Profiling." This incident has sparked a larger conversation about police accountability and racial profiling, the reporter said, her tone serious. Community members are calling for changes in the way local law enforcement interacts with residents, particularly people of color. John turned off the TV, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never seen himself as part of the problem, but now it seemed like that was exactly what he had become. As the weeks passed, the situation in the community escalated. What had started as a quiet conversation among neighbors had now evolved into a full-blown movement. The local news media continued to cover Evelyn's story, and more people from the community and beyond joined the cause. Protests were becoming more frequent outside the police station, demanding justice for Evelyn and calling for changes in the way the police interacted with the residents. The divide between the community and the police force had never been clearer. John Foster, now on leave, watched helplessly as his name became associated with the growing tensions. His face, once anonymous behind his badge, was now plastered on news reports and social media, sparking debates about race, bias, and law enforcement. He never expected to be at the center of a controversy like this. He had always seen himself as a protector, someone who worked hard to ensure that his community was safe. But now people are calling him something else entirely, a symbol of the problem. John's mental state began to deteriorate. Each day felt heavier than the last. He couldn't even leave his house without feeling the weight of people's eyes on him, as though the entire world was silently judging him. Even Claire, his wife, tried her best to be supportive, but their relationship was strained under pressure. It felt like there was an invisible wall between them, built out of everything John didn't want to talk about. Claire suggested therapy. "John, you need to talk to someone. You can't carry this alone." But John wasn't ready to admit that he needed help. "I'm fine," he insisted, his voice rough with exhaustion. "I just need to figure this out on my own." Meanwhile, Evelyn Robinson was also grappling with the weight of the growing movement. She had never intended for her story to spark such widespread attention. People from all over the city, some she knew, many she didn't, were now treating her like a figurehead in the fight for justice. Strangers approached her on the street, thanking her for speaking up. Activists called, asking her to attend rallies or give interviews. It was overwhelming. Evelyn appreciated the support, but she felt like her life had been turned upside down. She missed her quiet routine, her morning walks, her trips to the grocery store, her peaceful afternoons at the park. Now it seemed like every day brought more questions, more attention, and more pressure to keep the fight going. "I didn't ask for this," Evelyn confided to Aaron Thompson one evening as they sat together at her kitchen table. "I just wanted to live in peace." "I know," Aaron replied gently, "but sometimes we don't get to choose when we're called to stand up. You've inspired a lot of people, Mrs. Robinson. Your story is making a difference." Evelyn sighed, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. "I just hope it's the right kind of difference." John Foster knew he couldn't hide forever. The longer he stayed away from the community, the worse he felt. He spent hours pacing his house, replaying the incident with Evelyn over and over again in his mind. He had convinced himself at the time that he was following his instincts, But now he wasn't so sure. Was it really instinct, or had he let something darker, something more insidious, guide his actions that day? Eventually, John reached out to an old friend, Marcus Green, a former police officer who had left the force years ago to work as a counselor. Marcus was someone John respected, someone who had seen the same struggles but had chosen a different path. They met at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, away from prying eyes. John was grateful for the privacy. "Long time no see," Marcus said as they sat down, his voice warm but serious. "Yeah," John replied, rubbing his hands over his face. "I'm sorry for dragging you into this, Marcus. I don't know who else to talk to." Marcus studied him for a moment before speaking. "I've been following the news, John. I know what happened." John's shoulders sagged. "I don't know what to do. I feel like my entire life is falling apart." "You're questioning yourself," Marcus said simply. John nodded, his throat tight. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was being a good cop, but now I don't even know what that means anymore. Did I overreact? Was I profiling her?" Marcus leaned forward, his voice low but steady. "John, the fact that you're even asking these questions means you're already on the right path. Most people in your position wouldn't be willing to confront their own biases. They double down. They defend their actions without thinking about the bigger picture." John shook his head. "I don't want to be that guy. I don't want to be part of the problem." "Then you need to do the hard work of looking at yourself, really looking at yourself and asking the tough questions. It's not going to be easy, but if you want to make things right, you have to start by understanding where you went wrong." John's heart pounded in his chest. "And what if I can't make it right?" Marcus was silent for a moment, then he said, "You can't change the past, John, but you can change the future. You have to decide who you want to be moving forward." As the protests grew larger and louder, the pressure on the police department increased. The department was being criticized not only for John's actions, but for its handling of similar incidents in the past. Community leaders were calling for reforms, greater accountability, more transparency, and an overhaul of how the police interacted with residents. Captain Myers, the head of the department, was under immense pressure. He had worked hard to build a reputation for being fair and tough, but this situation was quickly spiraling out of control. He had to make a decision. Would he stand by his officers, or would he publicly acknowledge that there were issues within the department that needed to be addressed? Myers called a meeting with the department's leadership team, including the public relations officer and the city's mayor. They gathered in the small windowless conference room at the station, their faces grim. "We're in trouble," Myers began, his voice blunt. "The community is turning against us, and it's not just about Foster anymore. This is bigger than one officer. We need to address the underlying issues, or we're going to lose the public's trust." The mayor, a middle-aged woman with a sharp gaze, nodded. "I've been hearing from residents nonstop. They want action. They want to know that we're listening." The PR officer, a young woman named Laura, spoke up next. "We can't just sweep this under the rug. We need to acknowledge that there's a problem and make real changes. If we don't, the protests will only get worse." Myers rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "So what do we do? How do we fix this?" "We start by meeting with the community," Laura suggested. "We need to listen to their concerns. We need to show them that we're willing to work with them, not against them." The mayor agreed. "It's going to take more than words, though. We need to make concrete changes. Maybe it's time we reconsider how we train our officers. Maybe we need more community-based policing, more de-escalation training." Myers sighed, leaning back in his chair. "It's going to be a long road, but it's one we have to take," the mayor said firmly. "The question is, are we ready to do it?" While the police department grappled with its next steps, Evelyn found herself caught in the middle of a storm she never wanted. The movement that had grown around her name was now much bigger than the initial incident. People were calling for reforms, demanding accountability, and using Evelyn as a symbol of their fight. Evelyn didn't know how to feel about any of it. She sat in her living room one evening, the news on in the background, her mind swirling with conflicting thoughts. She didn't regret speaking up, but she hadn't expected things to escalate this way. Part of her wanted to retreat, to return to her quiet life, but another part of her knew that she couldn't step back now. Aaron Thompson came by that night, as he often did. He had become a close friend in recent weeks, always checking in on her, always offering his support. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," Evelyn admitted as they sat together. "It's too much. I didn't ask for this." Aaron nodded, his expression sympathetic. "I know it's a lot, but you're making a difference, Mrs. Robinson. People are finally paying attention." "But what if it's not enough?" Evelyn asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. "What if nothing changes?" Aaron's face grew serious. "Change doesn't happen overnight. It's slow, and it's hard, and it's frustrating. But the fact that people are talking about this, that they're demanding change, that's progress. It's not going to fix everything, but it's a start." Evelyn sighed, her heart heavy. "I just want to do what's right." "You are," Aaron said gently. "And whatever happens next, you're not alone in this." John Foster had spent weeks battling with his conscience, but now the weight of it all was becoming unbearable. He could no longer ignore the questions gnawing at his mind or the tension pulling him in every direction. The time had come for him to face the truth about his actions, and that truth was rooted in one simple fact. He had acted out of bias. It wasn't just a bad day or a misunderstanding. John realized that his actions toward Evelyn were part of a larger pattern of behavior he had never questioned before. Late one night, unable to sleep, John sat in the darkened living room, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. The house was silent except for the ticking of the clock, and the stillness felt suffocating. Claire had gone to bed hours ago, leaving John alone with his thoughts. He remembered every detail of the day he stopped Evelyn, the way he had looked at her and immediately assumed she didn't belong, the way he had felt justified in demanding her ID. But why had he made those assumptions? The answer was painful to admit. It had to do with the way he had been trained, the way he had been conditioned to see the world through a lens of suspicion, particularly when it came to people who looked like Evelyn. It wasn't something he had consciously acknowledged before, but now the truth was unavoidable. John knew he needed to talk to someone who would understand the gravity of what he was going through. He picked up his phone and called Marcus Green. "Marcus, it's John," he said when his friend answered. "I think I'm ready to face what I've been avoiding." While John was coming to terms with his own actions, Evelyn Robinson found herself at a crossroads. The pressure from the community was mounting, and people were looking to her for leadership. But Evelyn had never seen herself as a leader. She was just an ordinary woman who had been thrust into an extraordinary situation. The protests were growing, the demands for police reform were louder than ever, and Evelyn felt like she was standing in the eye of the storm. Aaron Thompson continued to offer his support, but he could even see that the weight of it all was taking a toll on Evelyn. One afternoon, as they sat on her front porch, Aaron asked her the question that had been on his mind for days. "Do you want to keep going with this, Mrs. Robinson?" he asked, his voice gentle. "I know it's been hard on you." Evelyn stared out at the street, watching the leaves blow across the pavement. She thought about how much her life had changed in such a short time. "I don't know," she admitted. "I didn't ask for any of this, Aaron. I'm not an activist. I'm not a politician. I'm just me." Aaron nodded, understanding. "I know, but you've become a symbol, whether you wanted to or not. People are listening to you, and they need you." Evelyn sighed, feeling the weight of his words. She wasn't sure if she had the strength to keep pushing forward, but she also knew that she couldn't just walk away. The community was counting on her, and more importantly, change was within reach. Just maybe this was her chance to make a real difference. After a long pause, Evelyn made her decision. "I'll keep going," she said softly, "but I want to do it my way." The climax of the story came when John Foster and Evelyn Robinson finally came face to face again. After weeks of introspection, John knew that he needed to apologize to Evelyn, not just for the incident, but for everything his actions represented. He had been on the fence about how to approach her, whether she would even be willing to hear him out, but he knew this was something he couldn't avoid. Through Aaron, John arranged a private meeting with Evelyn at the local community center. It wasn't easy for either of them to agree to the meeting. Evelyn wasn't sure she wanted to face John again, and John was terrified of what he might say or how she might respond. But both of them knew that this was a necessary step toward healing. The community center was quiet when they arrived, the usually bustling space almost eerily still. Aaron and Marcus were both there to offer support, but they hung back, giving John and Evelyn the space they needed. John stood in front of Evelyn, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to gather his thoughts. He had rehearsed what he wanted to say, but now, standing in front of her, words felt inadequate. "Mrs. Robinson," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what I did to you." Evelyn remained silent, her expression unreadable as she listened to him. John took a deep breath, pushing through his fear. "I didn't realize it at the time, but I was wrong. I acted out of bias, and I didn't treat you with the respect you deserve. I'm ashamed of the way I treated you, and I've spent every day since then trying to understand how I let myself get to that point." Evelyn's gaze softened, but she didn't interrupt. "I can't take back what I did," John continued, his voice cracking, "but I want you to know that I'm trying to change. I don't want to be that person anymore. I've been talking to Marcus, trying to figure out how I can do better, how I can make sure something like this never happens again. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me." There was a long silence after John finished speaking. Evelyn's eyes searched his face, looking for any sign of insincerity, but she saw none. She could see the pain in his eyes, the genuine remorse. Finally, Evelyn spoke. "I appreciate your apology, Officer Foster. It's not easy to admit when you've been wrong." John swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Thank you," Evelyn continued, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not going to say that everything is forgiven. What you did hurt me, and it hurt this community. But I believe people can change, and I hope you're serious about wanting to be better." John nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "I swear I am." Evelyn offered him a small but sincere smile. "Then let's work on changing things together." That evening, a large protest had been planned outside the police station, with hundreds of people expected to show up. It was set to be the biggest demonstration yet, and tensions were running high. The police department was on edge, unsure of how to handle the situation. Captain Myers had issued strict orders to keep things peaceful, but there was still fear that things could escalate. Evelyn arrived at the protest, standing alongside Aaron, Marcus, and other community leaders. John, too, had decided to come, though he remained in the background, unsure of how his presence would be received. As the protest grew, the energy in the air became electric. People were chanting, holding signs that called for justice and change. The crowd was passionate, but also determined to keep things peaceful. At one point, Evelyn stepped forward, climbing onto a makeshift stage set up in front of the police station. The crowd quieted as she began to speak, her voice carrying over the sea of people. "I never wanted to be here," Evelyn began, her voice steady but emotional. "I never wanted to be the face of a movement, but sometimes we don't get to choose what happens to us. We only get to choose how we respond." The crowd listened intently, their attention focused solely on her. "I've lived in this community for decades," Evelyn continued. "I've seen it change, and I've seen the struggles we've faced. But through it all, I've always believed that we can come together and make things better. And that's what we're here to do today. We're not here to tear anyone down. We're here to build something new." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers filling the air. Evelyn looked out at the sea of faces, feeling a sense of pride and hope that she hadn't felt in a long time. We need change. We need accountability. And we need to remember that every person in this community, whether they wear a uniform or not, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. As the applause grew louder, Evelyn stepped down from the stage, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't planned on saying all of that, but the words had flowed from her naturally, born out of the pain and hope she had been carrying for weeks. John watched from the sidelines, his chest tight with emotion. He had never felt more humbled in his life. Watching Evelyn speak to the crowd, seeing the strength and grace she carried despite everything that had happened, filled him with a sense of resolve. He knew that the road to redemption wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he truly believed he could walk that path. The morning after the protest felt like the dawn of a new chapter for the community. For the first time in weeks, there was a sense of peace in the air. The protest had remained peaceful, and Evelyn's powerful words had left a lasting impact on everyone who had attended. The local news outlets were filled with positive coverage, focusing on how the community had come together to demand change in a respectful and constructive way. Evelyn Robinson, however, was exhausted. The past few weeks had drained her emotionally and physically, and though the protest had gone well, she knew that the work was far from over. The movement was still gaining momentum, and people were looking to her for guidance. But for now, she needed a moment to rest. Aaron Thompson stopped by her house that afternoon, bringing her a fresh loaf of bread from the local bakery. "You did an amazing thing last night, Mrs. Robinson," he said, handing her the bread with a smile. "You inspired a lot of people." Evelyn accepted the bread with a tired smile. "I hope it made a difference." "It did," Aaron assured her, "and it will continue to. You've shown people that change is possible, but it starts with conversations. Difficult ones, but necessary." Evelyn nodded, feeling the weight of his words. She knew Aaron was right. The protest had been just one step in a much longer journey. The community had come together to demand change, but now it was up to everyone, residents, police officers, and local leaders, to continue the conversation and make sure that real reforms were implemented. As she sat down with Aaron at her kitchen table, sipping tea and reflecting on everything that had happened, Evelyn realized something important. She was no longer just a passive participant in her own story. She had become an active voice for change, and even though she hadn't asked for that role, she was proud of the impact she had made. John Foster had returned to the police department with a new sense of purpose. After the protest, he had met with Captain Myers and explained that he wanted to be part of the solution moving forward. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he was determined to change the way he interacted with the community in the future. Captain Myers had been hesitant at first. "You've caused a lot of damage, John," he had said during their meeting. "You're going to have to work twice as hard to earn back the trust you've lost." "I know," John had replied, his voice steady, "but I'm willing to do whatever it takes." And so Myers had agreed to let John return to the force, but with new responsibilities. Instead of resuming his regular patrol duties, John was assigned to community outreach. His job was to work directly with residents, particularly in neighborhoods like Evelyn's, to rebuild trust between the police department and the people they were meant to protect. It wasn't an easy job. On his first day back, John could feel the tension in the air as he walked through the neighborhood. People still recognized him, and many of them were skeptical of his presence. He knew he had a long way to go before he could prove that he had changed, but he wasn't going to give up. One afternoon, as John was helping organize a neighborhood meeting at the local community center, he ran into Aaron Thompson. The two men exchanged a brief, awkward glance before Aaron spoke. "You're back," Aaron said, his tone neutral. John nodded. "I'm working in a community outreach now, trying to make things right." Aaron crossed his arms, studying John for a moment. "It's not going to be easy." "I know," John replied, his voice quiet. "But I'm not expecting it to be. I just want to do my part." Aaron was silent for a moment, then he nodded. "Good. We need more people willing to do the hard work." The interaction was brief, but for John, it was a small step in the right direction. He wasn't looking for forgiveness or praise. He was just trying to rebuild the bridge he had burned, one conversation at a time. A few weeks after the protest, Evelyn received a surprising phone call. It was from the police department, asking if she would be willing to attend a community meeting at the station to discuss police reform. The department was starting to take the community's demands seriously, and they wanted input from residents about how to move forward. Evelyn hesitated at first. The idea of walking into the police station after everything that had happened made her uneasy. But after thinking it over, she realized that this was an opportunity to continue the conversation and push for real change. The day of the meeting, Evelyn walked into the station with her head held high. Aaron accompanied her for support, and she was relieved to see that other community members had also been invited to participate. The atmosphere in the room was tense but hopeful, as both residents and officers sat down together for the first time in weeks to talk about the future. As the meeting began, Captain Myers stood at the front of the room, addressing the group. "We're here today because we want to listen," he said. "We know there have been mistakes made, and we want to learn how we can do better." Evelyn appreciated the sentiment, but she also knew that words alone weren't enough. It was going to take more than just listening to bring about real change. During the meeting, Evelyn spoke up, sharing her perspective on what had happened and what she believed needed to change. "We need accountability," she said firmly. "We need to know that when an officer crosses the line, There are consequences, and we need more transparency in how the department handles these situations. John, who had been sitting quietly at the back of the room, listened intently as Evelyn spoke. He could feel the weight of her words, knowing that they were directed at him as much as anyone else. When the meeting ended, he knew he needed to talk to her. As people began to leave, John approached Evelyn cautiously. "Mrs. Robinson," he said, his voice low, "can I talk to you for a minute?" Evelyn looked at him, her expression guarded but not hostile. "Go ahead." John took a deep breath. "I just wanted to thank you for coming today. I know it couldn't have been easy, but your voice is important. We need to hear from people like you if we're going to make things better." Evelyn studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I appreciate that, but it's not just about talking, it's about action. The department needs to follow through." John nodded, his voice earnest. "I know, and I'm committed to making sure that happens." Evelyn didn't respond right away, but there was something in her eyes that told John she believed him. Maybe she wasn't ready to forgive him completely, but at least she was willing to acknowledge that he was trying. "That's good to hear," Evelyn said finally. "But remember, this isn't just about you. It's about all of us." As the weeks turned into months, the community slowly began to heal. The police department, under Captain Meyer's leadership, implemented several reforms, including mandatory de-escalation training and a stronger focus on community-based policing. Officers were encouraged to build relationships with residents, rather than simply enforcing laws. It was a slow process, but the changes were starting to take root. Evelyn continued to be a voice for the community, attending meetings and advocating for further reforms. She remained cautious, but hopeful that things could improve. Aaron was always by her side, offering his support and reminding her that they were in this for the long haul. John, too, found a new sense of purpose in his work. His role in community outreach allowed him to see the people he had once patrolled in a new light. He spent time listening to their stories, understanding their concerns, and working to rebuild the trust that had been broken. It wasn't always easy. There were still residents who looked at him with suspicion or anger, but he knew that change didn't happen overnight. One afternoon, as John was leaving the community center after a long day, he saw Evelyn standing outside talking with a group of residents. Their eyes met, and for the first time, John felt a sense of peace. He knew that he still had a long way to go, but he also knew that he was on the right path. Evelyn gave him a small nod of acknowledgement, and in that moment, John understood that while forgiveness might not come easily, the possibility for redemption was always there. The journey toward healing wasn't perfect. There were still challenges to overcome, still moments of tension and uncertainty. But for the first time in a long time, both the community and the police department were moving in the same direction, toward understanding, accountability, and change. Evelyn Robinson had never asked to be the face of a movement, but in the end she had become a symbol of resilience and hope. She had faced adversity with grace and had used her voice to demand better for herself and for her community. John Foster, once a man defined by his badge and his authority, had learned the importance of humility and growth. He wasn't the same person he had been before the incident with Evelyn, and for that, he was grateful. He had found a new sense of purpose, not as a symbol of authority, but as a bridge between the police and the community. As the sun set on another day, Evelyn sat on her front porch, watching the world go by. She thought about everything that had happened, the pain, the anger, the healing, and realized that while the journey had been difficult, it had also been necessary. And as John walked down the street, nodding to neighbors and stopping to chat with kids playing on the sidewalk, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. If you enjoyed this story and want to stay updated with more content like this, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Click the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any future stories about resilience, growth, and redemption. Your support means everything to us, and we're excited to bring you more meaningful narratives.